A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase.
I'll tell you what, after 2 months of not taking photos, really, this is not a bad place to restart. I thought there was going to be a sunset, but not sure of that anymore. It doesn't really matter after 2 months. What matters is that I've been able to drive somewhere and take photos. Anyway, while I'm out, what I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about exposure bracketing, because I exposure bracket pretty much all of the time. Don't need bracketing. And that is not particularly interesting in any way. The reason I want to talk about exposure bracketing though is that I think the reason I do it is very different to the reason that most people do it in my experience, based on what I've heard on workshops and talks I've done and stuff like that. So there's a reasonable chance that it might be semi-interesting to at least some of you, hopefully. So exposure bracketing, if you don't know, is the process of taking photos at different exposures in normally quite quick succession. And a lot of cameras can do that automatically. They'll have settings that enable you to bracket exposures automatically. So the camera will take 3, 5, 7, 9 photos all at different exposures for you. Or you can do it yourself manually by just adjusting exposures between each shot. If you're going to do that though, I'd suggest that you probably need a tripod in order to get exactly the same composition for each time you do it. And as many of you all know, I despise using tripods, so I don't do that. I did get all this B-roll yesterday on the hill. At least I thought I did, I just didn't press record. So yeah, doing it today indoors with a banana. It was just on my desk, I don't know why I'm doing it with a banana really. One other thing to note is that usually your camera will let you choose the increments between each exposure. So for example, you might choose to have 5 shots, but at like a third of a stop between each. What I do is I take 3 photos with a 1 stop gap between each. So I'll take 1 photo with the correct exposure, or what I've deemed to be the correct exposure, by fiddling with the settings and getting to the exposure that I want. And then the camera will take a photo underexposed by 1 stop and a photo overexposed by 1 stop based on the exposure that I've chosen. Obviously, if you're shooting in auto, your camera will decide the correct exposure based on its metering. But typically I choose my own exposures when I'm shooting in semi-automatic modes like aperture, which I do 95% of the time. So that, in a nutshell, is basically what exposure bracketing is. Now, most people, in my experience, I could be wrong, but most people like to exposure bracket because they want to merge those images in post-production. So in something like Lightroom, for example, you can merge all of those images to give you an image with a really high dynamic range. And you'll end up with an image that's got the shadows of the overexposed image, but the highlights of the underexposed image, which means that you're not at risk of blowing your highlights or losing any detail in the shadows. That's not true. You're at less risk of doing that depending on the dynamic range of your camera in the first place. Now, it should be said that doing that kind of thing in Lightroom or any other HDR software is, well, it's not always perfect. And a lot of the time you end up with an image that looks quite unnatural, to say the least. Now, you can quite easily take control of that process yourself by using something like Photoshop and using things like luminosity masks in order to select the bits of the image that you want from each exposure. But that's a little bit more convoluted, takes a little bit more effort. I can't remember the last time that I personally went through any of that for any of my photos, including the Lightroom one where you just basically click a button. So despite the fact that for pretty much all of my photos I bracket, I can't remember the last time I took all 3 of those images and put them together in order to give myself an image with higher dynamic range.
Apart from this one, obviously, which was strictly for demonstration purposes.
And that's because I think modern day cameras have plenty of dynamic range for the photos that I take. And to be honest, I can just find more interesting things to do than sit at a computer and play around with luminosity masks. And I'm the kind of photographer, broadly speaking, who thinks that if people are concerned about the noise in my shadows, for example, then I haven't done my job as a photographer telling a decent enough story, because people are worried about imperfections like noise or the fact that I've blown the highlights and not the story of the photo. And speaking personally, whenever I'm thinking about things like that, it means the photo itself hasn't really interested me all that much. So yeah, as I've said before a lot on this channel, I don't particularly worry myself too much about things like noise in the shadows and stuff. I prefer to take 1 photo, have a really good exposure that I'm happy with, and if I bring up the shadows and there's a little bit of noise, so be it. So that begs the question, if I never merge my images, then why do I bracket? And the short answer for that is that it gives me options, plenty of options. Every time I take a photo, like one here for example, I have 3 exposures to choose from when I'm editing in post or when I'm just importing into Lightroom. And I can choose the one I like best or the one that maybe my presets work best with if I'm feeling particularly lazy. And I can do that at basically absolutely no cost to my workflow. And what I mean by that is this G9 takes photos so quickly that it really doesn't matter. It doesn't hold me back, the fact that I'm having to take photos. So if you listen, every time you hear that click, that's 3 photos. So it's a super quick camera, meaning that I can take 3 photos very quickly, all at different exposures. Also, this G9 records 20 megapixel files, which means that it's not crazy amounts of data that I'm processing when I take 3 exposures. And like I said, in Lightroom, when I'm importing, I can just throw away the exposures that I don't deem any good. Yeah, so in short, I just end up with more options. The other thing that's really good about exposure bracketing, I think, is that if I'm taking a photo of, say, I don't know, a landscape that's got a bird flying through it, then even though these images are taken really quickly, which means that they're taken really small amounts of time apart, that can make all the difference when you're photographing something like a bird in terms of where their wings are, for example. And it can mean that their wings are either hidden, and in another exposure, a split second later, their wings can be sort of in a better position. Now, as you might have guessed, that doesn't always work out perfectly for me. For example, the wings might be in the best spot in the photo that's one stop overexposed, which in any given situation might be way too overexposed. At which point, I have a decision to make. Either I can just try and take down the exposure of that file and see what I get, or I can use the other files to do a bit of exposure blending trickery in post if I really want to, and I end up with an image that's either got lots of dynamic range, or maybe I just copy the bird across from the overexposed one and put it in the correctly exposed one. Gives me lots of options, basically. That's why I do it. Loads of options for very little cost, either in time or data storage, because my camera, the G9, takes reasonably moderately sized files. Hopefully that was clear. You might be wondering what I'm going on about with the Flappy Bird thing, but hopefully you get what I'm on about. That looks wonderful. I shall take a photo, 3 photos.
Right, thank you very much for watching. A couple of things to say before I let you go. I forgot to mention that on my G9, I use this little dial here to determine whether I'm bracketing or not. It's basically a function button, but it's not a button, it's a switch. And one of the settings is bracketing off, and the other's bracketing on. Without having the camera turned on, I don't know which is which, but that doesn't really matter, does it? Just works quite well, so I thought I'd mention it in case any of you have a G9 and think it might work well for you too. Also, this box that pops up in Lightroom when you're merging images together, I would always recommend that you turn off auto settings. Is that what it says? Yes, auto settings, because basically that applies a Lightroom edit on top of the merge that's going on. And I just think if you're merging images together, chances are you want more control over that image, and therefore why would you give some of the control over to Lightroom as far as the editing's concerned? I think it's nonsense. So get rid of that and just have a completely natural image that hasn't been touched by Lightroom to play with. That's my take anyway. You might disagree, but that's what I would advise when you're trying this. Like I said though, I never ever use this tool, so why would you listen to someone who never uses it? That said, what I do use is squarespace.com. So I've used Squarespace for probably 4 or 5 years now, and I've been really impressed with the service and with the product. It's my website in the background, which I think is probably the best example of an online photography portfolio platform. Not my particular website, I'm not saying that's the best example of a photography portfolio, but the platform I think is great. And probably my favourite thing about it is that you upload an image once and then Squarespace takes care of all the resolutions and the image sizing to make sure that your photos look great on any device for anyone in the world. And if I was in charge of that, I'd royally mess it up. So I'm pleased I don't have to worry about any of that. And if you've got a store on your Squarespace website, then it hooks up seamlessly to that, and so people can look at your prints and your books and all that kind of stuff at the same time as looking at your images. It's fantastic. If you're interested in giving it a go, then go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and if you like it after that, then go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase on your website or a domain. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.